In 2012, Hurricane Sandy inflicted some damage to the Connecticut shoreline, but it ravaged areas of the New Jersey and New York coastlines. What can we do in Clinton, Connecticut to reduce the adverse impact of extreme weather events, and particularly storms coming over Long Island Sound, with hurricane-force winds and possible inundation of areas of our town? And this question is first directed to Mr. Carr.
I think it's a really important question, whether you believe in climate change or not. Clearly, the storm systems are hitting us in the United States, the East Coast of the United States, more frequently. We've certainly been ravaged a couple of times, and we still are owed about $800,000 from FEMA from these two hurricanes. But anything that any town does to fortify their coast basically threatens their neighbors, because the water has to go someplace. So we need a regional solution to this. And when I say regional, I don't mean just the coastline of Connecticut. This has to be New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and we've got to think about what we can do to suppress some of the tides that are in Long Island Sound. I mean, the Dutch have been doing this for 500 years. I mean, we ought to be able to learn something. I call it the Zeider Z solution. Most people look at me like I'm crazy. I'm almost reluctant to tell you that that's something that I think that we should be thinking about. But if we could put up tide gates at both ends of Long Island Sound, and at high tide when a storm is coming, putting up those gates, we could solve the problem for Long Island or Long Island Sound and for surrounds. Almost anything else is a bunch of Band-Aids, and all those Band-Aids are going to be very expensive. And they're going to cause, in any Band-Aid you put on your problem, is going to cause a problem for your neighbor. So we have to think much bigger, and it's beyond Clinton, but I think we need to have a say in it, we need to be advocating for it, and I think we can benefit from it. If we don't, I mean, we have this big surge area in downtown Clinton that is a real threat to the livelihood of Clinton. If it really got washed out, it could be very hard to replace. We have a fire department that's in a floodplain. We have a number of these that are real threats to public safety, and they're urgent. I mean, I don't want to see us wait until we really have a disaster to address them, but they are big problems, and they're bigger problems than little Clinton by itself can resolve.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Mrs. Goupil?
I believe there's some issues that we can resolve on the local level. Specifically, the fire department is in a floodplain. At the last inundation, they were about 3 minutes away from evacuating, from what I was told. So that is something that needs to be considered, whether that site is appropriate. We also have to look at the causeway. That needs to be elevated, because that area is the egress for most of those residents down there in an emergency situation. These are things that came out of the Natural Hazards Mitigation Plan, which folds into a coastal resiliency plan. With coastal resiliency, there are mechanisms that we can do on the local level to address it with natural materials and creating buffers around Clinton that are natural through infrastructure with our coastal wetlands and expanding those areas. But at the end of the day, this is a issue that needs to be addressed at the state level, working with the River COG and other COGs around the state to find solutions. Because if one town, or many of the towns actually surrounding us, have solutions at the table and they're starting to implement those, and those are going to create issues for our town, because it could redirect the flow into Clinton Harbor, and that is problematic. So we need to go back to the state and say this is something that needs to be addressed, and we need to work with our legislators to make sure it is a priority for us before the next storms start hitting, because we need to have something at the table, a solution that is doable. But we also, within the planning community, within the town, we need to start creating a more robust GIS system in the town hall, and that is a repository for information to look at where the flood potential is in town and where those areas of infrastructure are potentially at risk. So there's a lot of different layers in it. So it's addressed at the local level, addressed at the regional level, and addressing at the state level. And these are all things that need to happen within town hall. And you really need leadership to be bringing these things forward. And that's the only way we're going to be able to resolve some of the issues for the next generations as well.
Thank you. Mr. Carr, would you like a rebuttal?
Yes, I mean, I think clearly, the things that our neighbors do that impinge on us really mean that we have to be constantly vigilant. I mean, there's no substitute for vigilance. And I know that we have some coastal resilience groups in town that are looking at this, and we've got to empower those groups, perhaps make them official, create some commissions perhaps. But we've got to empower the people of Clinton and those who understand the threat to coastal resilience, to give them the authority to speak on our behalf and to speak authoritatively.
Thank you. And Mrs. Goupil?
Right now, we really are in a deficit for information, and we don't have any professionalism at the table to be dealing with this. Unfortunately, last year there was a grant available for us to be able to access those professionals to come up with some plans on the local level. So looking forward, we're going to have to access some of the grant potential again. This is something I think that's going to be very difficult for the town to be budgeting. It's not something that can be done on a local level with residents. We need professionals at the table. And again, this goes back to the regional planning agency. We do pay fees to the regional planning agency, and they can certainly provide some services there. And then also going back to the state level, starting to have that conversation of things that can be done for our community that won't affect our surrounding neighborhood towns.
Thank you, Mrs. Goupil.